Throughout the late 40s, 50s, 1960s, you have communist parties in Western countries, particularly in Italy, that don't seem to really be doing anything at all to advance the actual interests of working class people. That are working hand in hand with the governments, frequently rather conservative governments, in order to keep the workers on the job, in line, accepting wage concessions, increasing productivity, working longer. So, you know, if you're in Italy in the 1960s and you're working in a factory and you're wondering when your wages are going to rise, it doesn't seem like the union or the party are helping you at all. Well, critical theory, is this going to offer us models for how we can gain more control over our living and working conditions? Well, the tendency of critical theory is to analyze the ways in which capital imposes its structure, the way that it structures social relationships, and its logic, its rationale, the way that it conceives of how society should function on the people living in advanced capitalist countries in Western Europe and North America and places like that. It doesn't focus so much on how people can resist this, right? It's on how this logic and this system of social relationships is being imposed upon us. Hence the emergence of the Italian New Left. Now, the Italians didn't invent this of their own. There are a couple of other theoretical models that were pretty marginal, but nonetheless had a very significant influence on the development of the Italian New Left beginning in the late 1950s. One of which was French, a journal and hence a theoretical tradition that's referred to as Socialisme Barbarie. That would be a good lecture for you guys. Socialisme Barbarie, which was headed by a Greek expat, Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lefort, that began publishing in 1948, I believe, and only finished publishing in the mid-60s. So the Socialisme Barbarie movement in France is one of the direct theoretical influences on the emergence of the Italian New Left. Another in the United States, which is generally referred to as the Johnson-Forrest tendency, also very, very interesting Johnson-Forrest tendency. That name comes from the pseudonym of its two leaders. Johnson, I think his pseudonym was J. Johnson, who was actually CLR James. Very, very interesting figure in the history of the American labor movement and American Marxist theory. He was actually a Trinidadian who came to the United States in, I believe, the 1920s and began working in communist movements and in the trade union movement. Ultimately began publishing under the pseudonym J. Johnson. And his theoretical partner, F. Forrest, is actually a woman named Raya Denilovskaya, who was a Ukrainian Jewish woman whose family had immigrated, I believe, to Boston when she was a young woman. And it's the Denilovskaya and CLR James begin the Johnson-Forrest tendency, first of all within the American Socialist Communist Party in the 1930s, and then they become sort of independent in the late 1940s. So what is about these movements that influenced the nascent Italian New Left beginning in the 1950s? Well, Socialisme Barbarie, again, which first began publishing in France in the late 1940s and 1948, focused not upon the political organization of communist political parties and how they were going to organize themselves and ultimately organize the social relations of production in order to improve conditions for working class people, did not focus upon how capital was infiltrating all sectors of social life and reproducing itself and its logic in all sectors of social life down into the functioning of bourgeois families. Instead, it focused on the experience, the everyday experience of actual factory workers in France. Famously published a series of diaries by a worker in a Renault factory outside of Paris. So the focus of Socialisme Barbarie was to chronicle the everyday life and the everyday struggles of real, actual, living, breathing, working class people. And I believe that was only through an analysis of how actual living, breathing people in capitalist countries were living and the struggles and difficulties and hardships that they were experiencing and the ways that they were organizing within the workplace in order to try and change the conditions under which they were living and working, that you could really come up with a truly progressive and revolutionary movement ultimately aimed at completely transforming society. This is one of the theoretical influences on the Italian New Left, bottom-up sort of grassroots approach to theorizing ultimately political transformation. The Johnson-Forrest tendency did the same thing, published a bunch of pamphlets that were largely based upon interviews with factory workers, mostly in the auto sector in the United States, mostly in Detroit, in the auto sector. They were also, Denievskaya famously, was the first person to reject the notion that the Soviet Union was a real communist or socialist country. Denievskaya was the first person, and this is pretty standard these days, to refer to the Soviet Union, beginning in the 1930s, not as a communist country, but as a country that is more felicitously referred to as a state capitalist country. It was a capitalist country because the goal of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, on the view of Denievskaya, I think that this is correct, was to put people to work. Put people to work. And that's not communism, and that's not Marxism on Denievskaya's view. Again, this is very much a theoretical influence that finds full expression in autonomous Marxism and the Italian New Left. On Denievskaya's view, on the view of the Johnson-Forrest tendency, the goal of truly revolutionary activity is not to expand production and to put more and more people to work while you're, making sure that they have proper wages and decent food and housing and that sort of thing. The goal was to end work, end wage labor. So, again, the Italian New Left itself was a movement that organized around a couple of journals, a couple of publications that first emerged in the early 1960s. Quaderni Rossi, Red Notebooks, that started publishing in '62, I believe. And '63, I think, the next year, Classe Operaia, which is just working class. So Red Notebooks and Working Class, early 1960s. These are the journals that sort of formed the nexus around which the Italian New Left movement began to form. But within Italy, theoretical precursors certainly started appearing in the mid and late 1950s. Most famously, a guy by the name of Raniero Panzieri, who, I got a quote from Panzieri, from 1957, so this is before the Italian New Left really emerged as a robust theoretical movement. It really didn't do that until the first few years of the 1960s. So this is a few years before the actual emergence of the Italian New Left, but Panzieri is a guy who becomes associated with the Italian New Left. And in 1957, he expresses one of the main tenets of the Italian New Left and ultimately of autonomous Marxism. This is a quote from Panzieri. His goal is to, quote, restore Marxism to its natural terrain, which is that of permanent critique.